My good friends at the Populism in Action Project, which is hosted on EA Worldview, uh, have asked me to say a few words about the effect of coronavirus on a U.S. populism. You see, the Populism in Action folks are doing great work looking at 4 European countries, Finland, Belgium, Italy, Switzerland, looking at populist parties, looking at their memberships, looking at their leaders, all within the context of these changing political systems. And they're thinking about whether the current crisis we're in is affecting what is taking place. Well, they came to me and said, can we learn anything from the US? Is there anything that's occurring over there in terms of the change in that political system and a populist movement? And I had to be honest with them and say from the start, I'm not sure we've got a US populism to start with. Let me explain. Populism for me is associated with the populist party that comes out of the late 19th, early 20th century. You see, you have this historical movement, which starts by representing agricultural interest. It's distrustful of big government, certainly distrustful of big corporate interest and of industry, thinks that they are rigging the system against farmers. It's distrustful of the financial arrangements at that point, such as the gold standard. William Jennings Bryan, the presidential candidate who represented the populist, railing against we will not sacrifice this country on a cross of gold. And it is a movement which, while being, quote, anti-establishment, has a very specific resonance in what it wants to achieve socially and politically. And even though it never gets anyone in the White House, Bryan fails in 1896 and 1900, you do get pieces of legislation, constitutional amendments, which in part derive from populism. Say, for example, the direct election of US senators. That's my type of populism. What we call populism in the United States today comes out of a couple things. One is general movements like the Tea Party movement, which railed against big government, especially in the wake of the 2008-2009 Great Recession, which railed against Washington taking power from the people, something that various groups have talked about for decades in America. And populism has been associated, I think wrongly, or tied to the notion of Donald Trump going into the White House. And there, I think we're into not just a cul-de-sac, we're on the wrong path entirely. Because what is happening in the United States is not populism. Donald Trump saying, make America great again, and hoping to engage crowds to propel him to office and to keep him there, isn't populism in the sense of a very well thought out program. And it is definitely not anti-establishment. Donald Trump is a member of the establishment. He might not really be worth billions. He tends to exaggerate his wealth, but he is someone who's been a member of the New York City establishment as a real estate developer, then branching out into other businesses, other franchise. He's a member of the cultural establishment as a reality TV star. Think about The Apprentice. And he has always been a member of the establishment in mingling with other politicians, even when he wasn't one. In other words, Donald Trump is playing a trick on the American public by saying, I'm going to drain the swamp, when he's always had both feet firmly in the swamp and still does. Because his administration, although it might have certain characters, influential characters like Stephen Miller, the xenophobe, the anti-immigration hardliner, it's been shot through and through with members of the establishment, like Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, billionaire hedge fund guy, Stephen Mnuchin, another financial guy who's now a Treasury Secretary. It's, of course, had members of the establishment who came from the U.S. military. Rex Tillerson, the first Secretary of State, for goodness sake, was the CEO of Exxon, about as establishment as you can get. So the idea that Trump in some way was upending government, nah, absolutely not. Trump might, for example, rip up environmental regulations, health and safety regulations, but he's not doing that in the pursuit of a small government as much as he is trying to benefit his friends who are in the energy sector and in undoing anything that Barack Obama has done. And when you talk about the expansion of the military, when you talk about Trump's attempt to expand government power to crack down on immigration, when you talk about, for example, a tax cut, Trump's most significant piece of legislation to date which largely benefited the establishment, the wealthy, you see how much of a smokescreen any type of populism supposedly is. So does that mean that I got to go back to my colleagues and say, sorry, folks, there's nothing to see here because there's no populism here? Not quite. Because if we're taking what's happening with coronavirus today, well, life takes unexpected turns and so does politics. So let's consider two things here. Coronavirus is a threat not to populism, it's a threat to Trumpism. What we have seen is not populism in a coherent, organized movement. We've seen a Trumpism, which is not necessarily coherent in terms of its policies. It has lots of slogans. Think about the wall with Mexico. Think about the Muslim ban. But it is largely devoted to one man, Donald Trump, his ego, trying to manipulate and to hold government, the powers of government, to that ego. On a daily basis right now, during the coronavirus crisis, White House briefings are not really there to talk about organizing policy, organizing actions, organizing medical supplies. They're those so Donald Trump can show off, can treat this almost as de facto rallies. This Trumpism, which is not just about Donald Trump, but about, for example, his family, who are in the White House with him, daughter Ivanka, son-in-law Jared. This Trumpism is a reduction, a narrowing of power, almost a plutocracy, a small group of people who almost in a sense have hijacked the entire system. And coronavirus threatens that. Because it's one thing for Donald Trump to shout about a wall with Mexico and never deliver it. It's one thing for Donald Trump to shout about all these magical things that he's going to do, hashtag winning, when having no clue really beyond, for example, taking retribution against the families of immigrants, separating children from parents, or taking retribution against environmental groups, or taking retribution about those who try to fight climate change. It's one thing for Trump to actually say, back me all the way on this, hashtag MAGA, and now hashtag CAG, keep America great again. And it's another when you're dealing with a virus that doesn't know Democrat versus Republican, right versus left, rich versus poor. Coronavirus can hit anybody. And if Trump cannot show leadership, to put it bluntly, if because of his mismanagement, hundreds of thousands of Americans are at risk of dying, something which Dr. Anthony Fauci, the government's top infectious diseases estimate, has just said quite clearly this week, if hundreds of thousands of Americans can fall victim to this, then Donald Trump can't play MAGA, hashtag winning with them. Some will remain embedded with him to the bitter end. Some of them are my relatives. Some of them will say that, in fact, you can't blame Trump because it's all perhaps the fake news of the media. It's all perhaps the Democrats who have undercut him. It's nothing to do with Trump. He never lied. He never deceived. He never stood in the way of trying to act with this crisis alongside all those doctors and nurses risking their lives. But that group will get smaller and smaller if this crisis expands. And that brings me to my second point, which now to talk to my colleagues is the reconfiguration here almost means that all the political concepts we work with, including populism, we have to check them at the door. Because the whole question, the whole, as it were, assumption that we would have movements in America, which is let's reduce government power, let's reduce the establishment's power, is reconfigured by this crisis. Put bluntly, you have to have government power to deal with a pandemic. You have to have a federal government trying to coordinate action, trying to ensure that people are protected, or if they fall ill, can get care to deal with this. And if the federal government cannot do this, and in this case, the federal government has been lax in doing this, then you have to have state and local governments that fill the gap, as they are desperately trying to do right now. That quite visible demonstration of government power takes all the theory from the universities, takes all the polemic from the television channels, and turns it into hard, cold reality. So, for example, when we get to the backside of this, when coronavirus begins to ebb, this will reconfigure the notion of where does the US government stand in delivering a national healthcare system? Already a vibrant question that has surged in recent years. Where does the US government stand in being able to deliver that system so that American people are protected? The days of small government in terms of healthcare are probably now gone. When it comes to the question of where does government stand in its relationship with corporations, with the private sector, in terms of delivering vital services, given this case has actually shown the tensions and arguably the failure of government working with private sector to do this, where does this redefine not populism, but corporatism? Where does this redefine the relationship between federal governments and state and local governments? Federalism. You have to deal with all those questions before you get to the idea of where does this redefine the notion of a populist movement surging from the ground in America to try to take over the levers of power. America is a distinctive country, thousands of miles east to west, north to south, 50 different states, which are all different from each other, which all have different resonances. So to organize a populist movement, to organize all those folks, that's always been a bit illusory in the first place, even given the late 19th century case. Perhaps if you have a certain issue, a crisis issue like we had, like the agricultural crisis of the late 19th century, perhaps if we get into not just a recession, but an economic crash, I may come back and revisit the notion of a populism if the entire system begins to collapse. But failing that, we're not talking about populism. We're talking about realignments here. And at least in terms of the American vision of the superficial slogans of populism, drain the swamp, for example, those slogans need to be dismissed because there will be far more serious questions in which that type of quick soundbite doesn't get us very far. Sorry, my colleagues in Populism in Action Project, I don't have answers for you. I got a hell of a lot of questions though, so let's keep discussing it. Thank you all for listening. Keep checking into the Populism in Action Project on EA Worldview. Check out our other material on EA. Drop us a line, let us know what you're concerned about, and we'll talk again to you real soon.